Petty triggers for war as a soldier grips his rifle, his hands sweaty. In just a few moments he was going to go into battle to face the most dangerous of human endeavors. He comforts himself, knowing that he's fighting for a good cause, for homeland, for his comrades. And because of a pig? What? The exact reasons countries go to war is complex, with years of resentment, building up until something sets the conflict in motion. That something can be major, like a surprise attack or flagrant territorial violations. But on occasion, it's something so petty and trivial that onlookers can do nothing except scratch their heads in confusion. The war of the pigs may be delicious, but they can also be troublemakers. And wandering swine almost started a war. The incident started over a broader dispute between the U.S. and Great Britain. The 1846 Oregon Treaty set the border between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel, except for, quote, the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island. The issue is that there were two channels, the Haro Strait and the Rosario Strait, the treaty not specifying which one was the border. In between the waterways were the San Juan Islands, an archipelago which both sides claimed as their territory. Both American and British settlers began colonizing the islands, with the British Hudson Bay Company setting up salmon fishing operations and a sheep farm on San Juan Island, and about 30 or so American settlers arriving shortly after. Both sides considered the others to be illegal squatters on their lands. Things came to a head in 1859, when a pig owned by Hudson Bay Company employee Charles Griffin began rooting around the farm of American Thomas Cutler. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and fed up with the pig's antics, Cutler shot it. Griffin found out and confronted him over the loss of his animal. Cutler tried to mollify the irate Griffin by offering $10 as compensation, but Griffin refused and reported what had happened to the British authorities. When threatened with arrest by a foreign power, Cutler sought protection from the local American military garrison. A 66-man company under the command of Captain George Pickett, of later Civil War fame, was sent to the island to protect Cutler from being apprehended. In response, the British governor sent word to 3 Royal Navy warships operating in the area, who arrived as a show of force. The Americans refused to back down, and soon a buildup of military forces began, with both sides preparing for war. Over the next month, more forces would arrive on both sides, with the British sending 5 warships and around 1,000 men, with the Americans sending around 400 men and 8 cannons, digging fortifications to repel the inevitable attack. This ever-growing tension was finally eased with the arrival of British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, who managed to convince everyone that it would be foolish for 2 major world powers to go to war over a pig. After some negotiations, both sides agreed to limit the number of soldiers on the island and to control it jointly until a permanent solution could be reached. In 1872, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany helped negotiate a new treaty that established the islands as American territory, where they remain to this day. It is still unknown if Griffin ever received compensation for his pig, however. The War of the Buckets are useful things, able to haul water, be used as storage, or any number of other tasks. But was it worth fighting over? For some medieval Italians, the answer was yes. The foundation for the conflict began 2 centuries before the war, with the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, based in what is now Germany. He and the Pope disagreed on the extent of imperial and papal authority, causing Frederick to invade Italy against a number of pro-papal city-states. Italy was divided between 2 factions, the Guelphs, who backed the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the emperor. It's much more complex than this, but this general state of affairs lasted well into the 14th century. Two rival Italian city-states, the Ghibelline city of Modena and the Guelphs of Bologna, sparred with one another with cross-border raids, a constant source of tension between them. Things came to a head in 1325, when a Modenese army captured a Bolognese fortress. Still buoyed by the victory, a bold group of Modenese soldiers snuck into Bologna. After skulking their way through town, they stumbled upon the city's well and an oak bucket. They grabbed their prize before exiting the city. When they found out about the theft, Bologna was incensed and demanded the bucket's return, which Modena refused. What was once sporadic raiding now spilled out into an all-out war. Bologna called on its allies and gathered an army of around 30,000 soldiers. Modena only managed to gather around 7,000 troops to repel the invasion. Though outnumbered, a large portion of their troops were highly trained and disciplined German soldiers, compared to the inexperienced Bolognese militia. Both forces met at the Battle of Zappolino. Though outnumbered, the discipline of the Modenese carried the day, and they routed their enemies. A peace treaty was signed shortly afterwards, ending the War of the Bucket after one battle. Many historians today have doubts about the validity of this tale, believing that the bucket was stolen after the battle and taken as a trophy in either event. The bucket in question is still in the city of Modena, and they have no plans on giving it back. The War of the Stray Dog in 1925, tensions between Greece and Bulgaria were at a fever pitch. The two nations had a tumultuous relationship. They had originally been members of the Balkan League, an alliance which drove the Ottomans out of the Balkans. This changed after a territorial dispute after the conflict, which was exacerbated by Bulgaria and Greece fighting on opposite sides in the First World War. Over the years, there were numerous border skirmishes between the two nations. On October 18th or 19th at Petric, a Bulgarian border town along the Kamar-Kapo Pass, Greek and Bulgarian soldiers nervously eyed one another. When something unexpected happened, a dog owned by a Greek soldier ran across the border. No one knows why the dog did this. Perhaps poor treatment by his master. Maybe he was a political defector. Well, in spite of the tense geopolitical climate, a soldier ran across the border in pursuit. Seeing a Greek soldier run across the border, the Bulgarian guards opened fire, killing him. The Greeks returned fire, and a general fight broke out. This exchange of gunfire led to a diplomatic crisis in which the Bulgarians urged calm, believing that the incident was a misunderstanding. The Greeks saw things differently, claiming that the Bulgarians had entered Greek territory and killed the sentry at his post, and demanded reparations and punishment for those responsible. Bulgaria refused, and the Greeks sent a force of soldiers to occupy Petric and other nearby villages. In the brief conflict that followed, about 120 Greek and about 60 Bulgarian soldiers became casualties, as well as 50 or so Bulgarian civilians, though the exact numbers are disputed. At this point, the League of Nations stepped in and demanded a cessation of hostilities. Greece was forced to pay reparations for their invasion and compelled to leave Bulgarian territory, ending the brief conflict. To this day, no one knows what happened to the dog that started it all. By the mid-1980s, Yugoslavia was being torn apart at the seams. Nationalist sentiment and resentment of their neighbors was on the rise among Yugoslavia's constituent republics. In May of 1985, Georgi Martinovic, a farmer from Kosovo, was admitted to the local hospital with a broken glass bottle wedged in his rectum. He initially claimed that he was attacked by two Albanian-speaking men while he was working in his field. A colonel from the Yugoslavian People's Army interrogated Martinovic, who then confessed that the bottle was inserted by himself for personal reasons. He would be transferred to a hospital in Belgrade. where his condition would be discussed by a team of doctors and investigators. There was a debate over whether or not it was possible for Martinovich to perform the act on his own, since the bottle was inserted wide base first, with many concluding that this was not possible alone, and that others must have been involved. Others maintained that it was possible with some effort. In the end, the investigators didn't pursue the matter further, and the case was dropped. The public, however, had a different reaction. The matter was discussed endlessly in the Serbian parliament and TV broadcasts, reporting continual coverage of every sordid detail they could find. Martinovich's case was latched onto by the ever-growing Serbian nationalist movement. The tale of assault by Albanian nationals drove Serbians into a frenzy of ethnic hatred, with some blaming a local Albanian family for the attack as an attempt to acquire Martinovich's land. Media outlets compared Albanians to the Ottomans, referencing the Ottoman execution method of impalement. Poems would be written and paintings would be made, depicting the Serbian Martinovich as a Christian martyr at the hands of Muslim Albania. The incident fanned the flames of nationalism, which burned even hotter. Martinovich's name a rallying cry for Serbian nationalists. While it didn't cause ethnic, religious, and political tensions to overflow, leading to the eventual breakup of Yugoslavia, which would eventually cause decades worth of conflicts in the region, it was an important inciting moment that played a major part in the long and bloody history of the Balkans. To this day, it's unknown whether Martinovich's injuries were caused by others, or if it was self-inflicted. Georgia Martinovich would pass away in 2000, taking with him the truth about what happened to the grave. The football war, football or soccer in America, is possibly the most popular sport on the planet. Fans of the game are passionate, to say the least, with tempers flaring and riots breaking out in both victory and defeat. It's no surprise then that a match's result exploded into open conflict. Tensions between the Central American nations of Honduras and El Salvador had been simmering for some time. In 1969, El Salvador had a population of around 3 million, crammed into the tiny nation, the majority of the land in the hands of wealthy elites, leaving many farmers to struggle. Neighboring Honduras had a much smaller population of around 2.3 million, spread out over a landmass 5 times the size. Seeing an opportunity for land, many Salvadorian farmers illegally entered Honduras, settling there without having any legal claim to it whatsoever. This angered lower-class Hondurans, who wanted the land for themselves and felt wedged out by the interlopers. There was also a land dispute between the two nations over islands in the Pacific Ocean. The Honduran government began a crackdown on the farmers. An anti-Salvadoran sentiment ran red-hot in Honduras, with football matches being the center of the conflict. During a tournament, clashes between Honduran and Salvadoran fans broke out at 2 games. The nations faced one another. Each nation won a game apiece. The rubber match held in Mexico City. The match was a World Cup qualifier, and both countries desperately wanted to advance. At the end of the second half, the score was tied at 2-2, 11 minutes into extra time. El Salvador scored, winning the game in the tournament. This was the final straw. Clashes between Honduran and El Salvadoran citizens became more violent. Honduras then broke diplomatic relations with El Salvador, and on July 14, 1969, the football war broke out, with El Salvador launching an incursion into Honduran territory. The Salvadorans overwhelmed the Hondurans, pushing deep into their territory, but the advance stalled out due to a lack of fuel and ammunition. The Honduran Air Force counterattacked and destroyed the Salvadoran counterpart. At an impasse, the conflict ended on July 18th after arbitration by the Organization of American States, resulting in El Salvador withdrawing from Honduran territory. In total, Between 3,000 to 6,000 people were killed, including a large number of civilians, and tens of thousands were displaced. El Salvador would be knocked out in the first round of the World Cup in 1970, losing to Belgium, Mexico, and the Soviet Union. The Pastry War in 1821. Mexico declared itself independent from the Spanish Empire. Breaking away from the crumbling Spanish Empire was the easy part. Maintaining civil order. That was something else entirely, as a multitude of different factions vied for control over the country. In 1828, Mexico's president, Miguel Pedraza, ousted Lorenzo de Zavala from his office as governor of the state of Mexico. De Zavala, however, had the support of military leader Antonio López de Santa Anna, who rallied his troops and stormed Mexico City. In the ensuing chaos, the pastry shop of French citizen Remontel was allegedly destroyed and looted in the fight. According to Mexican accounts, officers from Santa Anna's army simply refused to pay their bill. In either event, Remontel sought compensation for the damages, estimated at around 1,000 pesos. But the Mexican government refused. The matter seemed to drop, and in 1833, Santa Anna became dictator over Mexico and would be humiliated in 1836 when a part of Mexico broke away, forming the Republic of Texas. The failed attempt to bring Texas back into the fold was financially backed by the French, who were less than pleased at the loss of their investment. In 1837, Remontel, frustrated at the lack of interest in his cause by the Mexican government, sought help from his home country. Sensing an opportunity, the French government demanded 600,000 pesos in compensation for Remontel's claim, 600 times what his shop was worth, as well as payment for other loans France had given them. Once again, the Mexican government refused, and in March of 1838, the French sent a fleet to blockade the port of Veracruz. When negotiations once again stalled out, the French blockaded all of Mexico's eastern coastline from the Yucatan to the Rio Grande, with negotiations once again going nowhere. In November, the French launched an invasion of Veracruz. Santa Anna, who had retired in disgrace after the debacle in Texas, arrived on the scene and demanded that he be placed in charge of Mexican forces there. With no other choice, the Mexican government relented, and Santa Anna led the counterattack to retake the city. While fighting against the rearguard of the French, a cannonball struck him in the leg, forcing it to be amputated. In desperate straits, the Mexicans appealed to Great Britain, who helped negotiate a peace settlement. Mexico agreed to pay the demanded 600,000 pesos, but France did agree to forgive other debts. In the end, the French lost 8 soldiers and suffered around 60 wounded. The Mexicans suffered 224 casualties and were financially ruined, all over a pastry shop. War of Jenkins' Ear in March of 1738. Robert Jenkins walked into the British Parliament, carrying with him a grotesque artifact, one that would light the fires of war between two of the greatest powers of the age. Decades earlier, in 1713, Britain and Spain had signed a peace agreement during the War of Spanish Succession. The treaty stipulated the British would be granted asiento de negro, or permission to sell captive African slaves to Spanish colonies in the New World. British ships would be granted a license to sell 1 ship worth of their goods per year in Spanish ports. Some British captains, however, exceeded their 1 cargo a year limit, which the Spanish considered to be smuggling. After yet another war, a treaty was signed in 1729, which allowed Spanish ships to search British cargo vessels for contraband when in Spanish waters. In 1731, Robert Jenkins was the captain of the East India Company ship, the Rebecca, carrying illegal cargo of sugar. He was boarded by the Spanish sloop San Antonio, whose captain was convinced that Jenkins was hiding contraband. Jenkins would be hoisted up the ship's mast by his neck 3 times and thrown down an open hatch in an effort to force him to confess. Eventually, the Spanish captain drew his cutlass and sliced off Jenkins' ear. 7 years later, British politicians, as well as members of the South Sea Company, wanted to improve trade opportunities in the Caribbean and needed a reason to go to war with Spain. Jenkins was brought before Parliament to testify. He showed them his severed ear, which he had apparently kept with him for nearly a decade. This macabre display was more than enough to incite Parliament to action, and soon war was declared. There were other reasons as well, such as border disputes between British-held Georgia and Spanish Florida. Both nations tried to negotiate, but talks broke down, and on October 23, 1739, war broke out. The British sent forces to the Caribbean and mainland, North and South America. Both powers duked it out, losing thousands of men along the way, including a failed British assault on the Spanish stronghold of Cartagena de Indias, which cost over 10,000 lives, mostly through disease. The War of Jenkins' Ear would technically rage until 1748, though most of the fighting would be finished by 1742. This conflict would be absorbed into a much larger European war, the War of Austrian Succession. With the fate of empires hanging in the balance, interest in Robert Jenkins and his ear fell by the wayside. War may be serious, but what finally sets them off could be something so small and petty, historians can only shake their heads in confusion.